everyone, and welcome to this Windhorse Publications podcast. And I'm here today with Alice Collett, who's the author of a book that we're about to publish called I Hear Her Words, an Introduction to Women in Buddhism. My name is Dhammamegha, and I'm the publishing director at Windhorse Publications. Hello, Alice.
Hi.
So, why did you write this book, Alice?
So Women in Buddhism is my research specialism, and most of my books and publications that I've published since finishing my PhD have been on this topic. And this particular book, actually, the original idea for it wasn't mine, and the original idea came from Divan Thomas Jones, who's both a Buddhist studies scholar and a member of Triratna Buddhist community. So Divan and the former director of Windhorse Publications contacted me a few years prior to when I said yes to publishing, and suggested a book such as this. And it wasn't until 2019 when I myself had some experiences of practitioner communities that I really saw that a book such as this would be a good idea, and there was really a need for it. So there's been a lot of advances in scholarship in relation to women in Buddhism over the last 20 to 30 years. And I have heard people say that practitioner communities can be 20 or 30 years behind advances in scholarship. So it came to my attention that some practitioner communities were using older books that are quite outdated, but that were more introductory. And there wasn't at the time a broad introduction to the topic that surveys and explores all the recent scholarship of the past 20 or so years. So that's what I attempted to do in writing this book.
I'm aware, as somebody who publishes for a community of practice, if you like, what you're talking about as practice communities, is that what you called it? That this book is and previously I've done some studies in academic study of Buddhism, and I was quite struck by the fact that in this book you have a combination of writing from and about the Dharma, or the teachings within Buddhism, and also a sort of historical and sociological account of the development of practice communities and their traditions. And I was curious to hear a little bit more about how is your analysis different from a feminist one in this book?
Well, although I study women and women in Buddhism is my research specialism, I wouldn't necessarily say that I take a feminist approach to this myself, although there are a variety of feminist approaches to this kind of work, as there is more broadly. And some people have questioned actually as to the way in which my approach is different. And thinking about it, I would say that my engagement with my research and how I go about it has actually been influenced quite significantly by my grandmother. So my grandmother grew up in war-torn London in the 1940s, when there were more opportunities for women when the men were away at war. And then she lived through the 1950s when women were encouraged back into the home. And as a working class woman in London, she was very frustrated about the lack of opportunities for her to advance in life. Now, when second wave feminism happened in the 70s and 80s, she really instilled in all of us, her female grandchildren, don't ever let anyone tell you you can't do anything just because you're a girl. And so for me, growing up, age 5, 6, 7, I had that drilled into me almost before I had an awareness that anyone was going to treat me differently because I'm a girl, So, she was telling us, and I was sort of thinking, oh, they're going to, are they? you know, I hadn't really fully conceptualized that. I think we all get a sense of it, of course, when we're growing up as children, but I hadn't really fully conceptualized it. So I was sort of told not to let it stop me before I really fully realized it. And so I think then when I started researching and becoming a scholar and doing my PhD in Buddhism and started reading about the history of Buddhism, what I found was a lot of other women in history who also had said no and had not let it stop them, that they were women. You know, if society told them that they couldn't because they're women, they just ignored that, pushed past that, and got on with things anyway. So I think because of my experience of growing up and my experience of my grandmother, therefore, those were the sorts of things that I read and I saw in the historical data and the historical record that I was particularly interested in. Now, quite often, I think when people come to study women in history or become scholars and want to research and write about gender politics, quite often the incentive there is a sort of righting of wrongs, as it can be with feminism more broadly. Now, of course, I'm very supportive of that. You know, if feminists hadn't been trying to right wrongs, women wouldn't be where they are today. So yes, absolutely, I'm supportive of that. But sadly, what happened with Buddhist textual tradition, as I'm aware, has happened with other religious traditions as well. When focusing on righting wrongs, what one first needs to do is bring up the wrongs prominently and make the wrong center stage in order to talk about, you know, different aspects of them. So what's happened with relation to research on women in Buddhism, you know, certainly there are misogynist passages in Buddhist texts and women are treated as inferior within Buddhist traditions, and all of that really has very much become center stage, whereas other aspects that are much more positive, i.e. histories of women, contributions that women have made to the history of Buddhism, that has rather been sidelined because all of the other stuff has taken center stage. So my approach is different in that it's the rest of it that, you know, I'm particularly interested in and interested in exploring and bringing more into the fore.
So we'll come back to the stories of women in the tradition that you've been unearthing and writing about in a bit. But one of the things that was really striking for me reading the book is how you use Dharmic ideas about emptiness, about conditionality, non-harm, Buddhist ethics, in order to do an analysis of how women are treated and the way gender is understood in the tradition. Can you say a little bit more about why you took that approach, what approach you took?
Yeah, I mean, I think the broad issues with regard to the question of women in Buddhism really revolve around whether Buddhism supports gender equality, whether Buddhism supports the inferiority of women. And what gets all mixed in together, I think, is Buddhist traditions and Buddhist teachings. So in the book, I wanted to try and separate those out and have sections particularly on what the Buddhist ethics say about this, what the Buddhist doctrines say about this. And Buddhist ethics, as anyone who knows much about Buddhism will know, one of the central tenets of Buddhist ethics is the idea of non-harm. And I talked about the question of gender equality in relation to the idea of non-harm in the book, which actually I'd say is not quite as straightforward as you might think, because actually if you have a categorical view that women are inferior to men, then actually if you treat women differently because of that, that's not harming women, because women should be treated differently. That's the right way to do it if that's your view. So the question of non-harm is not that straightforward in relation to question of gender. And then I have another chapter on Buddhist doctrine in relation to women. And one thing I particularly talk about there is dependent arising, the doctrine of dependent arising, that all things arise in dependence on conditions and pass away if the conditions cease to be. Now, within Buddhist texts, what we find said about women quite often is that the reason women should be considered inferior to men is to do with women's nature. And a woman's nature is often reviled and said to be evil, manipulative, wicked, debased, etc., etc. So in the book, what I do is I take this idea of dependent arising, that all things come into being in dependence on condition and pass away when the conditions cease, i.e. The world that we experience it is always in a constant process of flux and flow. Things come into being and pass away. So I challenge this notion of a static female nature. Say a woman is, women are always and invariably manipulative. In relation to doctrines such as Paticca Samuppada, such that awakening and an attainment of nirvana wouldn't be possible if human nature was different than it is. Awakening is only possible because it's possible for human beings to transform, and women are human beings. You know, although things are negative things are said about women in the text, it's very, very, very rare to find anyone trying to suggest that women aren't human beings. So women are human beings, therefore they can attain awakening, therefore their nature can transform. So therefore one can't say women are inferior because of their nature, because any aspects of their nature that exist are subject to dependent arising and therefore can change.
I'm struck by two examples from the text that draw it out, maybe just to make that concrete. The one is around the 8 special rules, where you talk about the intent in the creation of those rules and the change of the intent over time. So for example, you're suggesting that actually both in terms of the ethics you were speaking about and in terms of this nature, it's more that that the monks at the time were in effect trying to protect women from unwanted sexual advances by creating the kind of social space in which they were seen to be under the care and under the protection of the monks, for example. And later on that might have become read differently or experienced differently, but at the time that wasn't necessarily the case, and that's the sort of history that's being opened up with it. And now I've completely forgotten what the second example was that was more about the nature. Oh well, maybe I'll come back to it. Can't remember now.
Was it about sexual transformation, maybe?
No, it wasn't so much about that, actually. I think the thing I was thinking about was those ways in which women are often described as, for example, manipulative or unbeneficial, are often in relation to sexual relationships. People aren't saying that about their grandmothers or their sisters or their daughters or their cousins, right? It's part of an issue about the nature of desire. And particularly in monastic communities, and men writing about how the presence of women can be difficult for them in a celibate environment, and that's a different thing from saying women are a particular kind of thing, isn't it? It's a sort of more situated, yeah, not universal, not universalizable, as you say. It's in a particular context. Those are the conditions for those kinds of views about women as well. Yeah, okay. You said that your intention when you started working on this book was to, in a way, survey the most recent research and make it more widely available, including to practice communities. And then you say that along the way, actually, you start to develop or come across a new narrative. Is that what you were expecting? And what is the new narrative that comes out in this book?
Yeah. But I don't think much of what happened when I wrote the book was what I was expecting. But actually, I was pleasantly surprised most of the time. But maybe I'll come back to that later. With regard to the new historical narrative that I talk about in the introduction, it's new in terms of an introductory book or a book of this nature, but it certainly relates to a lot of the work that I've been doing over my career and work that other scholars have been doing over the last 20 years as well. So what I talk about in that chapter is that scholarship on women tends to discuss certain recurring themes that are found in Buddhist texts and in Buddhist traditions throughout history, which are that women are inferior to men, that women can't become Buddhas, that it's bad karma to be a woman, and that women can't always be ordained as nuns. So a lot of the historical narrative about women in Buddhism can be shaped around these negative ideas and aspects of tradition that exist. So my new historical narrative, that I called it, was again, as I mentioned before, bringing into more center stage all the many and myriad women that have existed in the history of Buddhist tradition that have helped to make Buddhism what it is today. And really what I want to bring into the center stage is acknowledging the contributions of these women. And I mentioned before, I think that one of my chapters is focused around the question of does Buddhism support gender equality? And in deconstructing that question, my answer in the end is to say that well, actually, the answer to the question, does Buddhism support gender equality, is, well, Buddhism historically contains many and myriad contributions by women that need to be acknowledged. And if we fully acknowledge that, then what we mean by Buddhism becomes quite different when we ask that question. And it actually makes the question less relevant, I think.
It seems to me that's a really important contribution of the book. To have a more balanced history, and one that's not just about women but also is sort of by women as well, including their voices and histories and stories. And
actually it's more balanced in terms of let's not just focus on all these negative aspects that we find in the tradition. And yes, it's important to know about them, and I don't ignore them, and I do talk about particularly the misogynist passages in Buddhist texts in the chapter on Buddhist texts. Yeah, we have to acknowledge them and realize they're there, but that's really not the whole story. You know, some of the time that seems like that's really the whole story, and that's all people think there is. But these many women, you know, and when I was writing the book, my specialism is women in ancient India. And so I had to research a lot of different historical contexts and a lot of different Buddhist traditions to write the book. And I found women after women after women in all these different traditions. And it was actually quite overwhelming. And I do say in the book, you know, I couldn't do justice actually to everything that I found. It would have been such an enormous book if I tried to include in it all the contributions there have been to women throughout the history of Buddhism to make, you know, shaping Buddhism and making it what it is today, bringing it to different countries, setting up different traditions, etc., etc. So that's really the contributions of women that have made Buddhism what it is today is really what I want to bring center stage. And I hope that this book helps us move towards that. So that those aspects of women in Buddhism, you know, aren't put aside when we concentrate on, you know, what's negative.
Is that does that say something about the title?
Yes, I guess so. Yeah. And as I think I say in the introduction, you know, I once that title was chosen, the book, the more I researched the book, the more it really became about these many contributions of women throughout the history of Buddhism. And I have tried to write it as much as I possibly could in the words of these women from history as well.
So just a reminder that the title is I Hear Her Words, which is lovely, I thought. So it's really lovely to hear the process of discovery in your writing the voices, the experiences, the histories of all of these women that you come across and that are increasingly being researched and are increasingly part of the historical record. What did you learn along the way about these women practitioners? You have a section called Voices Through the Centuries. Maybe you could just speak about one or two of them that really struck you.
Yeah, as I just said, an important point I do want to make in this podcast actually is that, you know, it's probably not best in terms of talking about the book, but there's so much that I couldn't include because there's just so many stories and so much information now still available to us on these many women that have contributed to Buddhism. And just to give you one example from the book, which I think shows also that with regard, so there is now a lot of data, but there's still more to do. Actually, you know, we certainly haven't uncovered everything. So, for example, if I talk about Tibetan and Tantric Buddhism, so quite recently, scholars have started working on some Tantric Buddhist texts from the 9th to the 12th centuries that were authored by women. And research on that is very much in its infancy, and so far 10 female authors have been identified who have written at least one book. Some of them have written several. So this was women writing in these periods, writing tantric texts. These texts haven't been translated yet and haven't been studied very much at all. So we're just beginning to know about them. So that's, as well as all what I found already, you know, there's still more, actually, there's still more to come. But then with regard to what I found already, again, thinking about Tibetan Tantra. So one woman that I talked about is Magic Lobdrum, who lived between the 11th and the 12th centuries. So she's a well-known woman within Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but I don't know if she's very well known much outside of Tibetan tradition. Now, what I talk about in the book in relation to her is rebirth narrative. So, as I said, scholarship has talked about different aspects and issues in relation to women in Buddhism, one of which being that it's bad karma to be born a woman, and quite usually related to that is the idea that one needs to be born as a man in order to make progress on the path. So in this rebirth narrative that I talk about, Magic Lobdrum is a man in a previous life, in her life just prior to the time when she becomes an illustrious, esteemed female teacher who starts her own tradition, her own tradition of Tibetan Buddhist practice. So this rebirth narrative that I relate here is really a kind of reversal of fortune, and really challenges this idea that women need to be reborn as men in order to make progress on the path, because here we have most recent prior life as a man, rebirth as a woman, and then contribution and Buddhist practice and attainment.
So you write about a whole range of women across time and space, and there are some themes that emerge between their lives in their wishing to engage with the Dharma, their wishing to practice. What kind of themes were you writing about?
I think the recurring themes that come up in the lives of different women is really the main themes are to do with how women keep trying to be stopped. You know, you can't do this, you're a woman, you can't get ordained, you shouldn't get ordained, you can't teach, you're a woman, you can't succeed at practice because you're a woman. So many people, their family pressures to marry, so you shouldn't become a nun, you need to get married, that's your role, you're not respecting your parents if you don't do this. So these same things keep on and on recurring in the lives of different women down the centuries in different regions. And actually, the stories that I found and the stories that we have are really of women just continually saying no to that and finding ways around it, finding ways to get on with it, and finding ways to practice anyway, regardless of all these pressures, social pressures, to not do what they want to do. And actually, I'd say even coming into the modern world, we find this, you know, women in the 1940s, 1950s, wanting to practice, and again, pressure being put on them to stop them being ordained as nuns and becoming teachers, etc., etc. I talk about women in modern Thailand, and there are biographies of nuns from the early 1900s that we now have. And these biographies actually, although we're now in, you know, 1900, they really do mirror the biographies we have of nuns who were direct disciples of the Buddha in ancient India. So just the same kind of pressures and just the same type of attempts to limit women in what they do. And how they practice and who they teach. But I think I do say somewhere in the epilogue, you know, what strikes me, or what struck me again and again and again, is just how women triumph anyway, and they just do it anyway. You know, they have to fight so hard to overcome obstacles, but do. You know.
It's interesting, isn't it? There's so often for practitioners a contradiction perhaps between a social role, the social role that we're expected to fulfill, and the religious aspiration, or the aspiration to liberation, which always has a social dimension, I suppose. And that will be true for men as well as women, isn't it, in terms of what kinds of expectations people have of what it means to participate in a society, like to bear children for your parents and to earn money for your family, or, you know, it's just that women have particular pressures, and I imagine the more traditional the society, the stronger the boundaries are of what it is that a woman is supposed to do, or a man is supposed to do. And whether it's the Buddha walking away from his family, or women seeking to put practice at the center of their lives, there's going to be some tension there, isn't there? I wanted to put that in just because to sort of parallel out that question about sort of social roles and gender roles, so that it's not just, because obviously it's not just, I mean, I'm thinking about China and, you know, the monasticism starting up in China and the huge backlash there, for example, you know, where you have pro-social roles versus religious roles that are in contradiction. So who did you write this book for? What do you want people to be able to take away having read this book?
So I was aiming for a broad readership. So for anyone really who's interested in the topic, and they might be a student, a practitioner, a general reader, generally for a non-academic audience. So yeah, I hope that it will have broad appeal. Yeah, so some things that I've heard already from the few people who I know have looked at the book. One thing I'm concerned about is that what I do in the book is, as we've said already in this interview, so I challenge the idea that there's anything in basic Buddhist ethics or basic Buddhist doctrine that supports the idea of female inferiority. But we do find throughout history people trying to hold women back from making progress. And what I particularly don't want anyone to take away from the book is to walk away and say something like, oh, so it's not Buddhism that's the problem, it's Buddhist men who are the problem. And I do say in the epilogue to the book, and I talk a bit about sexism there, and my view is that sexism is an attitude that can be held by a man or by a woman. Sexism isn't just something that men do to women. There can be sexism against men as well, for instance. And I don't really adhere to the idea of making progress in relation to dealing with sexism by there being thinking of it as this kind of tension or buttressing up of men versus women. You know, and as I say in the book, many men have helped actually with regard to trying to move Buddhism towards more gender equality. Yeah, I think that anything that sort of dumbs down to this simplistic idea of it's the fault of men, or you know, it becomes a kind of embattled tribalism. Certainly I don't want that to be something that anyone takes from the book. You know, I don't think that any recourse to blame in this way really helps to resolve anything or helps to move anything forward. And actually the title of the epilogue is Reaching Across the Divide. So, you know, my view is that, you know, the more men and women can come together and work towards Buddhist communities and Buddhist practice that is underwritten by gender equality, you know, that's surely the aim, really, of coming back to non-harm. You know.
And coming back to your doctrinal point about conditionality or praticya samutpada, presumably there are certain kinds of conditions that support greater gender equality and the widest possible participation in practice and effectiveness of practice. And one of those will be the participation of men and women in that conversation across the divide, I presume.
Yeah, where there can be like true dialogue and not blame on either side. You know, actually historically, and certainly with the misogynist passages, women can be blamed for being desirable for men. We see that quite often. But I certainly don't want anything to be sort of turned around so that then it's like, well, it's not Buddhism, it's men. Not what I want to happen.
Yeah. So you've done an extraordinary bit of surveying in the research and the writing of this book. You cover very different sets of conditions under which women practice, you know, different kind of monastic communities, different Buddha and Bodhisattva figures, different kinds of Vinaya or rules for the community. What conditions do you think do provide the best support for a gender equality in practice?
Well, given that I say in the book that it isn't Buddhism that's the problem, the answer to that is really that it depends, and it depends on a variety of factors. However, you know, there are certain Buddhist countries and certain Buddhist traditions in which women can be ordained, and some in which women can't be ordained. So you might expect my answer to that question to be, well, countries and traditions in which women can be ordained would be better conditions for women to practice. But actually, what we can see if we look historically is it isn't the case that just because a tradition has female ordination as part of it, therefore women have fared better within that tradition. So I would say it really does depend on a variety of factors, and it's not always the case that there's not one answer that fits all different situations actually. But I think one very important part of it is having a teacher who is ethical and having a teacher who cares, and whether that teacher is a Tibetan teacher that starts off a new whole tradition in Tibet, or somebody who starts a small group in London, no matter how influential the reach of that teacher, it depends on that teacher and their ethics and their views and what they set up within their group. So one particular teacher who I came across and I wrote about when I was writing the book is Chen Yan, who's a very well-known female teacher in Taiwan, modern Taiwan. And her approach to gender issues is quite unique, actually, and very interesting. However, her approach has been criticised for entrenching gender division in modern Taiwanese society. So Chen Yan, as Taiwanese Buddhism is Mahayana Buddhism, talks a lot about the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin, and talks about developing compassion in imitation of Kuan Yin. And what Chen Yan has done is elevated what we would call traditional feminine characteristics of nurture and care, and made them socially and culturally important and central part of the Bodhisattva path. So something to which both men and women should aspire, to be more nurturing, to be more caring, to imitate Kuan Yin in her compassion. And as I say, I think I read something actually where a man said to her, "Oh, you've made my wife better for me because she serves me better because she's more intent on nurturing and care." Now, if it is Chen Yan's desire to do this in order to elevate the status of women, then actually to push women more back into domestic roles where they're more in a service role, probably defeats the object. But it's a very interesting, I think, and fascinating way to try to deal with gender politics by elevating so-called feminine qualities and making them socially important. So there are just various different ways in which these questions of gender can be addressed within different traditions. And it certainly isn't always the case that a rights-based feminism is always the answer either. You know, some instances have happened in some Asian countries which have shown us that actually trying to impose a rights-based feminism on the situation actually in itself has backfired as well.
I mean, I really encourage people who are listening to that to read some of these stories more in depth in your book. It's a hard question to answer in the abstract, isn't it? Because there are so many really concrete circumstances, and each one brings something else to the fore, I suppose. So hopefully you'll look forward to reading that. So towards the end of your book, you've got this you sort of set up your analysis in terms of gender equality and ethics and doctrine. And then there's this wonderful sweep of history where you've got this rich body of stories and analysis along the way of how women are fed in the tradition. And then towards the end of the book, you turn more to the sort of contemporary West and the movement of Buddhism into the West and the various issues that raises for women practitioners. So many people who will be listening to this podcast will be part of the Triratna Buddhist community, and you write a little bit about that as well. What do you say?
Well, one thing I talk about is the other Windhorse book on women and men that was published in the 1990s that we could say was a little bit problematic.
You're referring to Women, Men and Angels, just so that some people might not have heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a book written by Subhuti in the 1990s, where he put forward the view that women have less spiritual aptitude than men. What I say in the book about that is actually I concentrate on the response to it rather than the book itself, because the response to it was so strong that actually the book was recalled by the publishers just a few years after it went on sale, and copies of it pulped. So yeah, in the book, I concentrate on this response, and the way I understand it is that this was women and men within Triratna community saying, no, we don't accept this. This is not okay with us. So that's what I focus on, the response. And what I say is that it's interesting that we can see this response in the Triratna community to an attempt to, it seems, try to incorporate this idea of female inferiority into a modern Western Buddhist movement. And that seems to me to be the impact of second wave feminism on a modern Buddhist movement, in that people stood up and said no to it. So I contrast that actually with negative texts and negative statements about women we see in the history of Buddhism. Now, because of the response to Subhuti's book, what we see in Triratna is these ideas of female inferiority didn't become entrenched and ingrained or become any kind of foundational aspect of what Triratna is and what Triratna means. So that presents an interesting difference to what we see in Buddhist texts in the past, whereas negative views about women and texts which include negative statements, negative passages about women, did find their way into the tradition. Now, it might have also been the case, and we don't know, you know, as I say, I found many examples of lots of inspiring and outstanding women throughout history who you know, made great strides forwards, but I didn't find any example of this same sort of thing we see in Triratna. So, for instance, an attempt to introduce a text that categorically places women as inferior, and then a group, which could have been a group of men and women, saying no. But we don't know whether that happened or not. That could have happened in history, just like we know it happened today, right? But actually, that example we have of Triratna shows us something particular about women saying no, which, like I say, could have happened in the past, but also shows us how feminism can have influenced Buddhism in the present too.
Mm-hmm. I think I've come to the end of my formal and official questions. I suppose maybe what's your favorite bit of the book? Now that it's all done.
I don't even remember it anymore. I have to go and read it again this morning. Actually, I think my favourite bit is the last bit I wrote, which was chapter 2, where I say that the nuns replicate, when the Buddha said no to Mara's daughters, the nuns say no to Mara as easily and simply as the Buddha did. But the monks, their behaviour doesn't replicate or mirror the Buddha at all. I like that. What's your favourite bit?
Ooh, I think I really appreciated the kind of analytics that you brought to it. So I like the stories. I like the stories a lot. But there's sort of something for me that felt deeply right about grounding an analysis in an ethics around both intention and non-harm. That felt, as a practitioner, like that feels very congruent to me, that we're using in a way the best of the basic Dharma to attend to what's the best of what's possible in a tradition. And I think that kind of approach allows for all of us to have greater liberation in relation to our genders or the gender roles that are expected of us, men and women. So I think there's a lot of that a book like this can do that is in addition to a sort of history of women. I think it's a real way for all of us, men and women, to think about gender relations and other kinds of relations as well. How do we deal with social difference in our tradition? So I think it really lays down a ground that's very fertile. That's my favorite thing about the book. And the title. I like the title. So thank you, Alice. Thanks for your time. And I hope that many of the listeners will be reading the book that you have written and engaging with it, and that it continues to inspire more work in practice communities and in scholars to continue the sort of thread of research that you're doing. So thank you so much for your time and your energy and your answers today.
It's a pleasure.